Wow, there's a lot more people in here than I thought would be. This is the film scoring where you guys sure you're in the right room? I feel like we're kind of an odd breed, but this is really cool. This is awesome. Can I have a show of hands just so I can see who I'm talking to? It always helps. I might have to change this whole thing if I, depending on that. Who is a composer in here, or an aspiring composer, whatever? Wow, there's a lot of them. That's awesome. Very cool. I don't feel so alone. That's great. Well, my name is Tyler. I am a composer for film, TV, and arranger, producer. Music has been my life, I guess, since the age of 5 when I started taking piano lessons. But I feel super blessed to be in this industry. And I love this festival so much because I feel like there's such a camaraderie here. I feel like it's not a competition. It's like we're all encouraging each other, which is really cool. Really appreciate that. So felt very honored and blessed to be asked to teach this. And I hope you guys take away something valuable and are inspired and hope this goes well. So Lord help me. So as I said, music has been part of my life basically since I was born. I was born into a musical family. My dad is an aspiring Christian artist. And so that was kind of, I grew up in a very musical home. There was always music playing. And I always had this love of film too. So I almost saw myself as, I might want to be a director one day. I might want to be a writer. I want to make movies, but I had this love of playing the piano. I loved classical music. I loved instrumental scores. I used to listen to John Williams and all that stuff. That was kind of the soundtrack to my childhood. And so as I got a little older, I started experimenting a little bit in my dad's home studio. And with the software that was available at the time, I was like, it's pretty amazing what you can do. You can make things sound like a real orchestra without the players in the room, And so my brother, Ryan Smith, started to get into film. He started to write these stories and direct them. And he made a short film and said, hey, do you want to try to tackle the music here and come up with something? And I said, well, I've never done that before, but I'll give it a shot, And so I ended up writing the music for it, and I said, that was kind of fun. Well, a few years go by, he gets funding to do a feature and said, hey, you want to score my feature too? Oh, I've never done that before. I'll give it a try. That's pretty much been my whole career. I've never done that before. I'll give it a try, And so I didn't go to school for this, any kind of formal training, so this was kind of, but that being said, I can definitely pay tribute to a lot of people who've poured into my life and taught me a lot of things. So I've had a lot of mentors over the years. So that's, I didn't go to college, but I have been educated by others. So I'm very, very blessed and thankful for that. So basically, the way I've kind of arranged today is I'm going to be a little more broad today. I'm going to talk about the art of film scoring, what it is, and some techniques you can use to effectively score whatever film you're working on or whatever project you're working on. So this is kind of the history portion, which I'm going to kind of go through just a brief history of kind of how we got to where we are today. You guys can take a nap during this portion if you want to. We can get into but anyways, I find it pretty interesting, and you guys probably do too. So let's just talk about the role of music in film. So if any of you guys have ever watched a rough cut, which I'm sure you have, of a film, there's nothing more awkward, right, than watching it without music and with rough audio, right? It makes or breaks a movie. In fact, I scored a battle scene not long ago, and wow, that's really awkward. Without music and sound, no sound effects, no music. It's like, it's incredible how much the sound element is important in that. Another thing that you see it evident in is like montage sequences. So awkward, like uncomfortable to sit through without music. There's, it's such a vital part of it all. And so we can separate these two, separate these categories of art, in two different ways. We can look at visual art, we can look at music, right? And you can appreciate them as separate things. You can listen to a great album, you can look at an amazing painting, you can watch beautiful cinematography with no music and say, that's amazing, that's beautiful. But there's something special that happens when the two are combined, that, it pulls the viewer in a much more profound way. And that's, I think, what's really cool about film. Obviously you can read a great book, you can use your imagination, feel like you're there, but there's something about the blending of, what you're seeing and what you're hearing that just can really feel like you're part of the movie, right? So that's why I love my job. I love doing this. It's so fun. So, have you ever had that feeling when you're watching something, you kind of forget you're watching a movie? You're in a theater, maybe you forget you're in a theater. You're like, wow, you have one of those moments. I think that's one of the cool things we can be involved in with film scoring is we can help get the viewer into that place of feeling like I am part of this story. I know these characters. I feel like I'm part of the story, which is really cool. So, and let me use that word story, because this is really what film scoring is. We're telling a story, right? And it runs parallel to the narrative that we're seeing unfold on the screen. But their story is the most important part of this whole thing. If you think about it, the whole idea of going to a movie and getting lost in the story, you could call it mere escapism, but I think it's actually deeper than that, because stories have been tied to mankind since the beginning of time, basically, right? Our lives are a story. The entire course of human history is comprised of stories. You read the Bible and read some of the most amazing stories ever written, and they were real. They actually happened. So I think it's more something that's ingrained in every person. We're all drawn to story, right? And I think that's why we're all doing what we do, right? We have this thing inside of us that wants to tell a story. It's a very, very human thing about us that God put in there. Jesus even used parables to teach the principles of his kingdom, right? He was even a storyteller, right? He expressed stories because he knew, the audience, they'll be drawn in, they'll hear the story. So let's talk about music as its own entity, okay? So music has also been, around since the beginning of time. Have you ever met anyone who doesn't like music? That's just kind of a weird question, but I don't think I've ever met, it's like saying you don't like food, right? I don't think I've ever met anyone who said, no, I just don't care for it. No, it's kind of part of who we are as humans, right? Music has been around, and it's just part of our culture, right, as human beings. So I believe that at its foundation, it's divine, though. I believe God, obviously created sound. He created the science behind how the speed and quantity of vibrations affects the pitch that we hear with our ears, It's all comes from him, right? So we have drama and we have music, okay? So these two elements of the performing arts have been tied together for years and years. We're talking thousands of years. The ancient Greeks and Romans would utilize orchestras and choirs to complement their plays. During the Middle Ages, pagans would incorporate music into their festivals as they told stories of their gods and heroes. The church also would blend music with drama to share stories from the Bible. So moving on into the Renaissance period, which covers the 15th and 16th centuries, full of music and drama. Think Shakespeare. Then we have the Baroque period, which is the 1700s, where the first operas and ballets began to appear. And now in this modern age, we have film, which I think makes up the vast majority of the art that we enjoy today. In fact, the first motion pictures were first showcased in the 1890s, and this was the silent film era. So imagine this: they're playing a movie, right? You have a pianist sitting in the corner of the room playing along to what you're seeing on the screen. It was all live, or they had an orchestra, in the room. They're playing there to basically provide background music, filling up the silence, okay? And honestly, a lot of times it was for a practical purpose. It was to cover up the noise of the projector, actually. We need to cover that up, so let's put some music in here, why not? It wasn't as intentional back then. It was more of a filler, right? So fast forward to the 1920s, when we have the first talkies, and this is when the technology had advanced to the point of being able to synchronize film and sound, which is a huge technological advancement. it was very revolutionary, so much so that the film industry were kind of unsure of how the public would react to it because it was so not what they were used to. So they've, because their idea of film was silent, right? All the films they've been entertained by have been silent, no words, no dialogue, at least that they could hear. But this new technology was well received, and it paved the way to an exciting new future for movies. At this point, adding music to a film was very expensive and a complicated process because they were limited to whatever audio they captured on set. Can you imagine that? This meant that all the musicians had to be there and play at the level that wouldn't interfere with the dialogue. So also, if anyone made a mistake, the take was ruined, and let's do that again. And you know how expensive it is to use film, right? So it was a super, super, expensive process. So lots of pressure. This is how it was done until about 1931, when new technology allowed the music to be recorded separately and then added in, much like it is today, in a process called dubbing, which essentially is mixing the dialogue, sound effects, and score together, right? And it's kind of the same process we have today, right? So now at this time, film studios had their own music departments. They were completely in-house, staffed with composers, orchestrators, songwriters. It was, music editors. It just was like this big machine, basically, of music making for films, right? And they had a very large teams working at these studios. So part of this was to satisfy the growing appetite for filmgoers. So these studios were basically giant filmmaking factories, right? Things obviously changed as time went on, and now you find freelance composers who are not tied to any particular studio, like myself. So that was a big change that happened over time. Another thing that has drastically changed is the composing process itself. Because back in the day, you might find a composer alone at his piano with a piece of blank, sheet music, staff paper, writing in the traditional manner. Now you'll likely find a lone composer like myself with a laptop and a keyboard programming digital sounds and samples to make a score. One of the most incredible technological advancements is what we call MIDI, which I'm sure probably everyone in this room is familiar with because it's kind of how we do it nowadays. And basically this stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. And it's essentially a language that translates musical notes into digital information. Another element of this concept is what we call sample libraries, which I'm sure that a lot of this is just stuff you guys already know. But sample libraries are basically virtual instruments that are triggered by MIDI data. This gives you the instruments, or in some cases, complete scores, right? We call this method in-the-box scoring. So basically, you can create something called a mock-up, right? Where literally the whole orchestra is digital. It can be later replaced with live instruments, or it can be used as such, which is called in-the-box scoring. This is obviously much more affordable than live, and hiring an entire orchestra, right? It's very expensive to do that. In my opinion, I always opt for live, but they don't always have the budget for live, right? So we have this option available, which is great. So technology has changed the way we create music, and the art of film scoring itself has evolved. As we discussed in earlier times, music was there to fill empty space or the sound of the projector, But as time went by, it's became more of an art and more of a integral part of the film, right? There's this art form appeared called film scoring, which you are actually scoring to the emotions of what's going on screen. I think you think of people like, John Williams was kind of like a master of this. If you hear, is this piano usable? Let's see. If I play this, what do you think of? Right. Just two notes. You guys all knew what it was, right? So, even if you just take that theme, for example, it's just those two notes, right? And everybody knows what it is. It doesn't always have to be complicated, right? If you think about like a bloodthirsty shark, that's a pretty simple character, right? They're just out to eat whoever's in their path. So The most dissonant interval is the most, the best choice, I think, that John came up with. And he said, that's all we need. So, I mean, it's totally appropriate, though. From a musical standpoint, I think it's kind of brilliant. And even that pulsing sound almost mimics a human heartbeat, right? And that's what all our hearts would be doing if we were in the water with the great white shark, right? So you can see how music can translate into like human feeling and emotion. So as I said before, story is really what we're after here. That's what we're trying to help craft with the score. It's the sound to our story, right? So I think it's super helpful to think of the story and the score as parallel to one another. And this might seem kind of obvious, but like, let's just break down the elements of a story, okay? So I'm not gonna use all of them, I'm just gonna use some of them to explain my point. So setting, for example, that's kind of the first one we'll discuss. So from a visual standpoint, the setting is going to have a pretty big effect on the overall tone of the movie, right? So that should absolutely be taken into account when approaching the score. This will often affect the sound palette that you choose. And by palette, I just mean like what type of instrumentation are you using? What kind of sound are you crafting, that's going to be the flavor, I guess, of your film? And what styles will be infused into your writing? A post-apocalyptic thriller set in a dystopian world is going to have a totally different sound than a modern-day romantic comedy, right? I mean, completely different. This element is certainly the most visual, and so I would encourage you to be inspired by what you see, looking at the setting, looking at the way the film looks. This is where that setting element, I think, comes into play. So I'm going to use an example from a film I scored called Washington's Armor. It's actually a film trilogy, and the first installment released this year, it's called The Journey. But let me give you our setting here. So it's a frozen landscape in the northern US, a formidable river filled with ice, daring two of our characters to cross. This is the scene. So let's hear how the score ended up sounding for this. I kind of forgot to test sound on my computer. Let's make sure it actually works. That's my fault, I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to go into settings here. Here's a great question. If I AirPlay it to the choir room, is that going to work? It'll go to what? Okay. Well, we don't want that. We want this. We want this. We want the speakers. Yeah, I thought it would come out HDMI, but is it possible to connect sound into here? I mean, you guys can all huddle around my laptop if you want and just listen like that. I can get a pair of headphones and we can all take turns. But I think every time I have to rely on him because every single project I go, how do I do this again? I can't remember. And every project's so different. But yeah, to answer that, I definitely lean into him for sure. So. When I watch somebody else's film, that's a good question. Sometimes I can tell, and I'm sure there's probably been times where I can't tell. I guess maybe I'll ask you guys if you can tell, because I'm going to be playing maybe examples of both. If he asks if something was in, okay, when I'm watching a film, if I'm able to tell if something is in the box, meaning if everything is programmed versus live. Sometimes I feel like I can tell. There's other times where probably it's a little less obvious. Is there a call that you have to make it? a great question. And my answer to that is it should be in their budget if they want that. There are times where there's like a few different options you can go with. I like to think of it in three categories. You have, live, and that's when like 80-90% of it is going to be tracked with a live orchestra, and all that. That's more the traditional kind of way of doing it. Second would be, in the box program, so everything is basically synthesized. And three is what I call hybrid, and that's pretty common actually, where you'll find that part of it is live, but it's blended in, with the samples. So you might have a quartet of players playing something and then just layering it in with the different samples, which I've done all three of those. So are we connected now? I think we are. You want to get one more? Okay, cool. So yeah, go ahead.
So while we wait, could you describe a typical day in the life of a film scorer?
What is the typical day in the life of a film composer? Is that what you said? Okay. Could look like a number of things. Panic, yeah, lack of sleep. Gosh, that's a great question. It's very different, and every project is different too. I guess the process is similar in a way of how you approach something. My preference whenever I'm working on a project is to get involved as early as I possibly can. I love to get involved before anything is even shot, actually, but that doesn't always happen. A lot of times they'll give you the whole thing and say we need it in 2 weeks or whatever, which is a lot of fun, but it's not really. But I like to have time to really get a handle on the story and the characters. To be honest, my preference is to hear a concept and start the writing process there versus seeing the whole thing. I like to hear, what is it about? What's the heart of your story? And how can I start to experiment with ideas? So I actually will write themes ahead of time so that then when I'm actually starting the, two-picture scoring, I have those themes in mind and they can kind of come out and evolve. And every score is different. There's things that come out along the way that you're not expecting, like, oh, I didn't expect that coming. But I think every day is just, honestly, me just sitting down and trying to figure out what sounds good, what doesn't, what I need to keep, what I need to throw out. And obviously a lot of that, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but I'm going to talk about the relationship between director and composer is super key and vital, to keep communication between the two, pretty frequent. So often I'll send ideas, in the very beginning of, hey, how do you like the direction of how this is going? And is this kind of right? It's better to have that conversation before than halfway through the movie. You need to change direction and go back and fix everything, So yeah, I definitely like to think ahead of time with these things. On occasion, that can happen. It depends. That's actually kind of more common nowadays with the technology we have, for you to see that sort of thing. I know Hans Zimmer does that a lot. He writes to the script a lot of times. I think it's kind of cool. It kind of can set a tone on set if they have an idea of what the music is going to sound like. I think it's helpful. I think most cases you will find that is not the case, but I'm definitely not against it. That's for sure. Sure.
At what point do you make that call? I know that there's obviously
Sure. Yeah. What I'll say about that is what I find, I mean, it's kind of, it, the bigger, I guess the more like, the more you have going on in the music and in the score, the more elements that are present, the easier it is to get away with doing in the box scoring, in my opinion. You know, it covers up imperfections. It kind of, it creates this kind of illusion in a way, like things that are more stripped down. Like let's say you had just a solo violin and a piano or something like that. You're going to be able to tell more with that, you know, versus having doing that live. So it really kind of depends on your score. There's some scores that are suited to that more. Definitely more modern hybrid scores, I think, are more appropriate to be used with samples. But to be honest, like I've done a lot of program scores. Like that's kind of, I feel like I've done more of that than I have live. And so I'm really, really impressed with how far we've come technologically when it comes to that. And I think a lot of what you will hear today is probably going to be programmed. So, yeah, so you'll have to be the judge of that. If you tell me if you think it's terrible, don't say anything. But no, I'm kidding. No, I want to hear your thoughts. Do we have sound now for this? Perfect. Okay, so let's go back to the scene we were in because I think we've probably forgotten by now. We're in this frozen landscape up north. We're in the south right now, so just use your imagination. A formidable river filled with ice. You know, our two characters are deciding, should we cross, should we not? So this is the scene, and this is the palette that I ended up using in the score for this moment in the film. Very short little example, but what are some things that stuck out to you about that?
Sounds cold.
It sounds cold. There we go. That's good. That's what I was going for.
The way the vocals fell sounded a little synthetic, but it was almost like perfect in a way where it sounded really, really cool. But there was still enough authenticity in there that was sounding good.
Well, that's good. I was hoping for that too. Some tension. There you go. That was that was definitely one of the ideas. And I think a lot of times, like, you can think of scoring as like, especially in this type of scene where it's like the environment is kind of like it's almost like a character in and of itself. The river is kind of its own, you know, it's almost like the antagonist, the villain in the scene. So something low and kind of menacing and kind of something that almost mimicked the river in a way. So there's this low kind of rumbling quality that I was kind of going for there. And, you know, with the vocals felt like they added almost like a voice to the water in a way, you know. And there was a bunch of sound design going on in the scene too. I wish I could play you the scene so you could see, but like, you know, you have the sound of the wind and it's snowing. It's, you know, there's this rushing river. And I also intentionally made a lot of this score is this way, but like, because there's a lot of these big, vast landscapes, so it just sounds, I wanted it to sound large and vast, you know, and that has to do with a lot of layering, you know. There's a lot of elements going on in there. There's these, you have, you know, some really low synthy kind of drones going on. You have the vocals, you have that beat. And so that's just one way you can kind of shape your score to fit the setting, right, and the atmosphere. And so that was a palette that I kind of created where what I mean by palette is it's like when you're painting a painting, right? You have a certain amount of colors you're painting from, right? It's the same thing with sound. So you create a sound palette. That's why I encourage, you know, with each score, I typically will stay, you know, I like to start from scratch and build it because I I'm not a big template person. I understand people use those and they're helpful, but I feel like each score has its own voice, and so I like to start from scratch. That way you avoid the problem of going, well, I have all this stuff in my template. I feel like I should be using all of it. Well, no, for this film, you might not need to, you know. I think so starting simpler and building from there is better than starting with something massive and then having to subtract, if that makes sense. So I'm going to give you another example with this setting category, which is going to be completely different because this film was just a completely very different, had a very different tone, but also it's a period piece as well. So it's set in the 1800s, and it centers around the nieces and nephews of John Henry Hopkins, who's the famous hymn writer who wrote We Three Kings. The film is called We Three Kings. Were you involved? Awesome. What did you do? Art director. Good job. It's a beautiful film. Oh my gosh, you were there. Oh my gosh, good to see you again. Yeah. They filmed one scene at, I can't remember, it's some kind of plantation there or some kind of house, like a historic home. Yeah. Yeah. It was beautiful location. Yeah, the film it's got a very beautiful look visually. But it's completely different than Washington's Armor as far as the direction. So most of the film takes place in like a family home and the local church. It's got that period feel to it, but it's a lot more like, I don't know how to use it, not as vast as Washington's Armor is more of these like vast landscapes. This is a little more personal, based around a family. So because of that, I think the score needed to be simpler. You know, it needed to be more traditional. And even like the main character of the movie is the young girl is a aspiring pianist, a classical pianist. So a lot of the score has this very classical sound to it, and you'll hear that in this example that I'm playing. It's also a Christmas movie, so it's got to have a little bit of Christmas flair to it, and you'll hear that as well. So here's a piece from that, which is going to sound a lot different than what we just heard. So there's that. So very different though, right? So what are some emotions and things that come to mind when you hear that? Cheery. There we go. Warm. Yeah. Cozy. Sounds like a Christmas movie to me, you know. But you know, there's it needed to fit the setting, right? So it's lighthearted and simple, keeping in mind that the subjects of the film are children, right? So there's a childlike aspect to it, right? And a lot of the instrumentation that I used really kind of complements that. And so obviously those are two completely different examples of how setting can affect your score, right? But that's why I encourage you guys, like when you're looking at a movie, look at it visually. How does it look? And visually, you know, is it, you know, what you're listening to? Even just looking at, I'm not even talking about story at this point. I'm not talking about characters even. I'm saying, let's look at our setting. Let's look at the tone of this movie. Is the sound palette that I'm using appropriate, you know, to this film? So that's my spiel on setting. The next category, which I think is probably one of the more important ones, and I think it's the one that we all connect with the most because we're human beings, is characters. It's definitely the most personal, right? So, I mean, a well-written character is easy to empathize with, right? Or get mad at, right? It's like, we you know, that's what we're drawn into most of the time is the characters, right? Because it kind of can reflect us, right? We understand it, it's humans. We tend to feel what the character's feeling. The main way that this translates musically is through themes. I think it's very important to give main characters their own distinct sound, something that the audience can recognize, and those themes will evolve as the character arc develops, right? So it might sound completely different at the end of the movie, but we've kept that theme intact, that we've introduced them with. That's definitely one of my favorite parts of the scoring process. I've always said something that sounds funny, but like, it's easier for me to write a film score than write a good song. I don't know, that sounds weird, but like, I have basically 2 hours to tell this story versus like if you're writing a song, you have to tell it in 3 minutes. You know what I mean? Like, so I like the process of, how themes develop over the course of a film. There's a natural progression that happens. It obviously has to complement what they're going through in the movie and stuff, but it's a really fun part to me of we're using these same, sequence of notes, but we're using them in different ways as they go through these different seasons in their life. So let's talk about some practical ways to approach these themes. I think first, look at the complexity of your character. That's super important because, a simpler character, I think, calls for a simpler theme. Let me use some examples from a film I scored called A Match Made at Christmas, another Christmas movie. I tend to do a lot of those. So we're going to talk about the main character. Her name is Holly, go figure. Overall, she's a pretty simple character. She loves Christmas. She's festive. She's cheery. She's a go-getter, wanting to help plan every event, including the wedding of her brother and best friend, Angela. Let's hear a bit of her theme. So what are some feelings we felt with that one? Festive. And sleigh bells. Christmassy. You can't go wrong with sleigh bells if you're doing a Christmas movie, right?
I love the richness of it because I've been listening to a lot of different, especially Christmas, and they're just really cute little, you have the richness with that, the feeling of it. I love. It was amazing.
Well, thank you. Go ahead. Yeah. Cool. Say that again. Resolved. There we go. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Thankfully, you guys are all like composers, so I can use some language that I probably wouldn't use in other settings. Go ahead.
Was that all in the box?
That was all in the box, yep. So it's kind of an example of what you can do with some of the technology out there now. This is great. So, obviously, we said it's festive. It's Christmassy. We have the woodwinds happily singing the melody with some sleigh bells to carry the tempo along, right? But as the movie progresses, we learn that not everything is sunshine and mistletoe for Holly, okay? She's still waiting for that special someone to come into her own life. That sense of waiting is even further accentuated by her desire to see snow fall during the Christmas season. You often see her kind of reaching out, longing like for it to fall. It just never comes. She's just waiting on it. So there's a waiting element to her character that you see as the film goes on, that she's content, but at the same time, there's that sense of longing. So here's how her theme is played in that context. cry anyone, but how did that one make you feel? A lot more intimate, yeah. That's perfect. That's perfect for this kind of movie, yeah.
The diminished chord gives you a feeling of anticipation.
Perfect. That's what I was going to mention is I think there's another aspect to like when you're writing cues is to think about like the way it ends is really important because it's setting up the next scene, right? And it's also kind of, it's putting a punctuation mark sort of on the end of your sentence. So is it a period? Is it a comma? Is it a colon? Is it a semicolon? It's a super important thing. So in this situation where she's waiting and kind of disappointed in a way, I made the decision to, instead of resolving it, I just left it hanging on that chord, right? On that 4 chord, which is opposed to resolving to the 1. You guys probably know what I'm talking about when I'm saying that, right? I'm in the right, this is the right audience. Okay, good. Now I don't have to think of another way to explain it or go into a full-on music theory class. But to add to that tension, which he mentioned, that diminished chord, so it instead of just it being a straight 4 chord, it's this minor, it's this diminished kind of sound, which I think increases that kind of feeling of longing. You could have used just a typical 4 chord, right? But adding that element to it is I think helpful to the scene and what she's feeling in that moment, right? So it's very different, obviously, from the first version we heard, right? It's a lot less uppity. It's a little more you're kind of seeing inside of her, what's going on in her. And so that's just a way that you can, those are the same theme, but just completely different context and completely different way of using it. Go ahead.
I could be wrong, but there seemed like there was a hint of that at the very beginning, like the last chord, not this one, the one before it. There was a minor chord, second to last.
There was.
There was just a little bit.
Yeah, there was a little bit.
I was like, there's something there.
Yeah. So I did kind of hint at that in that opening theme, but I think because of the tempo and the upbeat, it kind of you pass over it like, oh, that was interesting, but not, we're not going to hold on that. And there's, even in that first sequence, you do see like, she's happy, but you can tell there's a little bit more going on in there. And so I'm going to play you one like last version of her theme toward the end of the film. This just kind of show you the progression of how theme can work in a movie. So this is the last one, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this one. Now, how do you feel now? Do you feel relieved? Go. Oh, yeah, no, what were you saying? Go ahead. There you go. Yeah. Well, what he just said, honestly. This all comes down to the music theory part of things where, before, I use that example from the more where she's longing and disappointment. Well, we're finishing the sentence. And sorry, I don't want to spoil anything, but that's like that's like end credits right after that. Yeah, so it is resolved. So like, it's, if I can play real quick, I don't have a whole lot of room down here, but so right, so it's that resolve. It's that going from, and it's actually in the 7th. Sorry, my bad. I can't reach. There we go. So it's called you guys know what a cadence is, or most of you might, I think, maybe, but it's a perfect cadence. So it's, even the melody is playing, it's going bum, bum, right? It's taking that 7th degree and going up, and that is the most satisfying sound in all music. It's been, I mean, it's I did not come up with it. It's like the most common thing you've ever heard in your life, but it does make you feel, we're done. You know, it's wrapped up. It's resolved. It's finished. So.
It sounds like she finally got the guy that's snowing. Sort of.
You know, it's a pretty good guess. You have to watch the movie and find out. You've seen it, okay? Yeah, yeah. No, it's obvious. I don't think I'm giving anything away there. I think it's pretty obvious. I mean, you just look at the cover. It's there's snow and he's there, and that would be weird if that was. Anyways, yeah. Movies like that are supposed to be sort of predictable. That was fine. Yes. So. Yeah, so that's kind of, those are three different ways of playing out a theme, right? You know, you have your, there's a character arc that develops in the movie, you know, with every character. So I took you on a small little journey. It's much, if you watch the whole movie, there's a lot more to it, but those are just kind of three examples of how to play the same theme in different contexts. So, thank you. I just want to ask real quick, is this supposed to be over at 12:15? That's good to know. Okay. Oh man, what am I going to do? I'm trying to see if I'm going to show you another example, or we should just do more questions. I'm going to play you one more example, and then we'll just end with questions. And I'm going to move on to the next story element, which is, well, plot. So that's it's a big part of it, right? It's kind of what's going on in it. It's the driving force of the narrative. It's the heartbeat, kind of what keeps things moving along. And so I'm going to use an example from Washington's Armor, where George Washington and his troops are marching through the forest to meet up with the Iroquois Native Americans, who are supposed to help them in fighting the French. But trust and betrayal are two pretty heavy themes in the movie. So there's definitely a sense of suspense and kind of them not feeling totally certain that they're going to be on their side, right? So I'm going to play you how that theme plays out. And I'm actually going to ask you how you guess things turned out. If you haven't seen the movie already. I think this is it here. So were they on their side? Was everything okay, or did they turn on them? What do you guys think? Everything's okay? Yeah, everything's okay. But there's still some of that, suspense in there. And this score is very, it carries that element of just suspense throughout the whole thing, because there's, it's a war movie basically. So there's got to be suspense, right? So from listening to that, anything you want to note, like that you noticed about? It shifted the mood, right, to the, yeah. And that's actually, what played at the very end is actually Washington's theme. So it plays between that kind of minor and major thing where it's, he's a serious figure in it, but it's also like, there's like this hope element too of like him, he's gonna be heroic, so. And during that scene, okay, so basically they're meeting up with these Native Americans that are supposed to help them, but they're not really sure if they can trust them or not. And they're supposed to march against, and they're basically supposed to raid this French encampment, basically. They're going to go up against the French, basically, and they need all the help they can get because they're a small group of people. So that's kind of the... It's a great question. I mean, a lot of it is you're sitting in front of it and this is another thing I wanted to talk to actually. This is probably something I should address before we wrap this up. But as much as like all these techniques are great and, you can analyze everything and talk about music theory all day long, nothing compares to instinct when it comes to composing, in my opinion. That's with any kind of art form. I think we're not really thinking, a lot of times we're not really thinking about what we're doing. We're not going like, I think I should do a major second here, and I should, this definitely needs to be diminished. I'm not thinking any of that. It's actually after the fact when I start to analyze things a little more and go, oh, that's why that works, And so when I'm honestly doing this kind of thing and teaching helps me a lot because I get to think like, I don't know, it's hard for me to think, how am I going to teach people what I do when it's just what you do, right? I mean, all you can probably agree. So taking a step back and looking at, okay, there are actually techniques and different ways of approaching things, but don't let that get in the way of you using your instincts. A lot of times, honestly, it's me sitting in front of a scene that I have no idea what to do with and experimenting until something sounds good. I mean, that sounds like a simple way of approaching it, but that's kind of a lot of what I do. Go ahead.
Where do you usually start a composition process? Where do you usually start?
In composing just any piece of music, like
Let's go
film scoring. So like like the score as a whole, or as like a piece, a cue.
So you start from scratch. So I'll just
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Exactly. So when I was talking about how I don't really use a template, I kind of build. I build a template per movie I'm working on. Basically, I build it from scratch. So basically, I'll either watch it, read the script, whatever level of production they're at. I will start to kind of formulate this plan of a palette to use for the film, right? So, and I start writing a lot of times I start experimenting with ideas before I'm actually scoring the picture. So that's where I really start, is going, this, wonder what this person's theme is going to sound like, or this, at least, or what's the sound of this, the setting we're in, what's kind of the flavor that we're going to use. So what I'll do is, let me think, for Match Made at Christmas, for example, I wrote 3 minutes of music right after I watched the movie, just straight off of inspiration and instinct, that I was just kind of felt after I watched it. And I sent that to the director, and she liked it. And every theme, almost every theme I wrote in that 3 minutes is in the score. As in, two of the themes, at least for sure, were used throughout the entire movie. And just from me sitting down and messing around and coming up with a 3-minute piece of music. So I would encourage you to do that. Like you could call it a sketch. Hans Zimmer does that. I know he writes like a 10-minute thing of like a sketch of this is how the themes in the score are going to sound. But starting at that, I think, is good because it's kind of setting up your ideas, and also will set up your palette too, because that whatever piece you're writing, you're going to start to build some type of sound palette for the rest of the score, and that'll change as you start scoring a picture. Things will change. You'll realize, okay, that's not working. We need to do this instead, or we need to add this element. But that's kind of as simple as I can put it. That's kind of where I start. Yeah.
Do you have like a lead instrument you like to stay with the winds or with the...
Do I have a favorite instrument that I?
No, I mean like as you're doing that process,
Oh yeah.
is it typically a piano?
A lot. Yeah, I'm a piano player. That's kind of my background. So that's a lot of times I will do a piano. But I mean, there's times where I've gone more linear, like line by line, with a different instrument. It depends. It's kind of. I would experiment with doing it a few different ways. So you don't get locked into one way. A lot of times as piano players, I think we kind of tend to think a little bit too much like a piano player. And when we have this whole orchestra in front of us, sometimes we can get a little limited to what we can do with our two hands. You know what I'm saying? And just kind of thinking outside the box a little bit helps.
Do you ever deal with you breaking your reluctant and you like it so much that your creativity stops and you just can't keep repeating yourself and you can't think of new material?
Absolutely. Yeah, that definitely happens to me. And that's another topic we could do a whole class on, like writer's block. But I read a great quote recently. It was from John Williams. I'm going to paraphrase it because I can't remember exactly what he said, but he said he never really encounters writer's block. Kind of jealous of him. But what he said basically was just write, just every day create something, whether it's good or bad. Just actively do something, and you might discard it. You might throw it out completely. But that's how you start. Because honestly, there's a movie I'm working on right now where I've got stuck a couple times of going, I just honestly do not know what this needs. I do not know. I just feeling like nothing. Like, just start with a note, start with a chord, start with something. And you might, as you build on it, you might go, this is working. You might go, this is terrible. I'm going to start over, But at least you're moving forward in some way, Go ahead.
Do you base your rate on the overall budget of the film or not?
That's a great question. Do I base my rate, like what I charge to? Usually they base it on that. Ish. I don't know. Yeah, every project's different. I've heard before, like, I think like it's supposed to be like 2% of the budget or something like that. I've read that. There's different percentages that I've read too. I don't know. It just depends on. I usually will ask. I'm not a strict I will only do it for this amount type of person. You don't want to put yourself in a situation where you're starving and barely making anything. But I look at each project like, okay, I like to ask, okay, what are you guys working with? What do you have set aside for music? And let's see if we can make it work. A lot of people charge per minute of music they write too. That's another way of doing it. Whether that number is 200, 500, it could get pretty high depending on what level you're at. But
Does that affect the complexity of the music then too if you're charging by the minute?
Well, that's a good question. Overall, no. I think it kind of balances out on the end. When you're looking at a score, you have pieces that are pretty simple. You have things that are really complex, and I think in the end it kind of all balances out a little bit. That makes sense.
Do you have a preferred set of sample libraries? I mean, everybody's got like their own.
I do. And if you come tomorrow, I'm going to go. This is my more broad kind of class. Tomorrow is going to be a lot more technical and kind of. I'm going to do sort of like a live scoring session. Lord help me. I did it once before and it worked. That doesn't mean it's going to work this time. But you get to sit with me in my writer's block if that ends up happening. We can do it together or something. I don't know. I got a lot of musical people in here, so maybe you guys can help me.